June 5th, 2024. Spiritualism Exposed. Sabbath School Quarterly Lesson for June 7th, 2024. The Living Temple. Alpha of Deadly Heresies. There is a chart. The Alpha and the Omega of the New Vineyard. Thought questions. The Sabbath School lesson, June 7th, 2024, discusses Spiritualism Exposed. Here is the link. Spiritualism Exposed. Deadly Consequences of Spiritualism equals State of the Dead. Spiritualism in the Last Days, Part 1 and 2. Excuse me. Referring to 2 Thessalonians 2, Revelation 13, 13-14, with Matthew 24. The lesson asks an important question on page 130 here. What subtle spiritualistic influences might Satan be using to influence the mind? What role does mass media play? Comment. This is in fact a very good question. It must be asked, what has influenced the mind of millions for centuries when it comes to religion, and what inroads have the doctrines of devils, 1 Timothy 4, influenced the cause of spiritualism? This will be discussed. A chart for illustration is provided. Includes 2 supernatural events in our generation that were missed. The chart, Spiritualism in the New Vineyard, 6 a.m. to 5 p.m. Parabolic clock, Spiritualism, Godhead. Here you have 9 a.m., first century. You have angelic emanations, same as eternal Son doctrine, but as intermediaries to the unknowable God. Old workers all pass by 9 a.m. Docetic warning. Spiritualism greatly affecting the Colossian church. Take heed lest there be in any one that maketh spoil of you through his philosophy and vain deceit, after the tradition of men, after the rudiments of the world, and not after Christ. For in him dwelleth all the fullness of the Godhead bodily. 80-70, destruction of Jerusalem, times the nations commences, and that's Luke 21-24. On this side we have emanationism. Let no man rob you of your prize by voluntary humility, and worshipping of the angels dwelling in the things which he has seen, vainly puffed up by his fleshly mind. Precursors in the first century, preparation for unity consciousness experience, also practiced in India for enlightenment, which things have indeed a show of wisdom in will worship and humility and severity to the body, but are not of any value against the indulgence of the flesh. In the 3rd century, 12 p.m., we have the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. It's a type. The transgression of desolation. Daniel 8:13, 1290 years. The Trinity and the eternal Son, God, the eternal Son. That's emanationism, transgression of desolation. Central doctrine of the little horn. At 3 to 5 p.m., Sister White said, mind taken to the future. When signal would be given, that was in 1896. Pre-Advent judgment, the nations. A signal, times of the nations closing. Sister White said study Luke 21. Councils of Writers and Editors, page 24. The coming King, the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. In this book, The Coming King, this will be when the work of the gospel is finished. At 5 p.m., signal given by Jesus, Kairoi, or probationary time of the nations, church bodies fulfilled, Luke 21-24. Jerusalem no longer trodden down. Basic law enacted, 1980. The result, Laodicea was warned. Sabbath School Quarterly in 1980 about Luke 21-24 fulfilled. Then in 1980, fundamental beliefs number 2 and 4. Here's links. This chart will be in the description box below. Alpha and Omega Heresies. Trinity, God, Eternal Son. The result is this. Laodicea, Exodus at 5 p.m. equals departure and parable of 10 virgins, Matthew 25 and Hebrews 13:13. The first angel's warning. Also, the 102nd Congress clasped hands with the 7 Noahide laws. Laodicea, one God, with fundamental beliefs 2 and 4. Ezekiel 9, literally fulfilled. Pre-Advent sealing. It's Revelation 7. The prophet Ezekiel, looking down the ages, had this time presented before his vision to the close of the account at 5 o'clock. Antitype. Abomination of desolation. Daniel 12:11, Matthew 24:15, for the 1290 days. And here you have over here on this side the 2 witnesses. At 6 p.m., national ruin. It's true, the state of the dead is important, but guess what? Millions have not seen why the Godhead doctrine of Mystery Babylon, the mother of harlots, is forged in the minds of millions and remains a fortress for spiritualism and mysticism. It found its way into Laodicea's fundamental beliefs in 1980. Someone asks, is it true the central doctrine of the little horn remains a fortress of spiritualism? Yes. Fact is, Sister White warned about the Alpha and Omega of deadly heresies. Secondly, many forget the strident warning of the first angel concerning spiritualism, and this has to be discussed. Why? Because very few get it. Why? It's the masterpiece of deception and the masterpiece of deviltry. Don't think for 1 minute Laodicea's doctrine of God is fine and nothing to worry about. The reason why this is very serious is that we are all dealing with the apex of spiritualism at the time of the pre-Advent sealing, and what Sister White called the Alpha and Omega of deadly deception. The deadliest of the many forms of spiritualism that rules the day at the time of the Antichrist. Yes, the biggest issue, bar none, at the time Jesus described as the abomination of desolation, and worse, when you realize the Alpha and Omega is official doctrine in Laodicea. The perfect snare of Luke 21. In 1903, Sister White warned Laodicea about the book Living Temple by John Harvey Kellogg. Was the Alpha of deadly heresies? But as you will discover, she never defined either the Alpha and Omega of deadly heresies. Living Temple. When the book Living Temple, 1903, released by Kellogg, was a classic health book, but turns out, even with all the marvelous health advice, the subtle guile of spiritualism entered Laodicea. While Sister White picked it up and signaled a clear warning, what didn't change was the info on health was helpful, and was way more than that, than the divine energy ideas. The elder, a dean of a theology faculty, had class read this book and find the Alpha of heresy. No one in the class found it. It was so faint, the Alpha of deadly heresies, and the errors of believing that the body has a divine energy that works on its own was not noticed. Examples of energetic principles of Living Temple. As an example, chiropractors believe the energetic universe nonsense, that the spine was where the blocked divine energy with the body, that when released by the adjustment subluxation bring healing. When back is adjusted, they would say the power is on. Supernatural event. A supernatural event of spiritualism occurred in Laodicea in 1980 that proved E.G. White's concerns were accurate. She did say regarding these theories, when taken to their extremes, would annul the cross of Christ, just as Docetism achieved in the 1st century AD. See chart. This is true, and the reason is that Neoplatonism's original premise of the void universe presents the matter in its true light prior to the pre-interpretation of the Church Fathers. See chart. And this is where you need to pause this video, click on the link and pull up the chart, and please cross-reference this. While E.G. White's premise was true to a certain extent, there are Bible verses that can be used to support Kellogg. But these verses are in relation to Christ upholding and sustaining the universe by the same power that he will use to resurrect our bodies. It comes down to the question that what Kellogg inferred about pantheism. Are these laws or energies divine? And some would say that they are, and some not. Only but allos, since everything, including the universe, is subject to change. See Hebrews 1. And on this earth, the creatures also die. In other words, the realm of spiritualism exists, and few recognize the supernatural potency of spiritualism. Fundamental issues of the Alpha and Omega of deadly heresies. Living Temple does not address the fundamental issues of the Alpha and Omega Neoplatonism and its final frontier of spiritualism. But you have to ask yourself, why the fundamental issues of the Alpha and Omega, when unopposed, that permitted a supernatural event to happen and then become Laodicean doctrine? Why? No one had a clue. The academics at faculty level waved through the central doctrine of the little horn, accepted without question as gospel. The spiritual guardians and betrayed their sacred trust. Spiritualism ruled the day because the leadership were so worried of bad press that SD Adventism was perceived to be a cult and not Christian. So the Lima text was adopted. Jesus had noted the issue. We must worship God in spirit and truth, hence its connection to the first angel's warning. Jesus saith unto her, Woman, believe me, the hour cometh, when ye shall neither in this mountain, nor yet at Jerusalem worship the Father. Ye worship ye know not what. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. But the hour cometh, and now is, when the true worshippers shall worship the Father, in spirit and in truth. For the Father seeketh such to worship him. God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. Back to Kellogg. Kellogg downplays the importance of the anthropomorphic of the divine, not realizing that analyzing the he who made hologos' greatness outside of the realm of the anthropomorphic, and is doing a disservice to the cause of Jesus Christ, since the resurrection body was anthropomorphic and had unlimited powers, and was not the hiding of energetic or consciousness principles. The true doctrine of the Godhead establishes the anthropomorphic Elohim, in whose image man was created in Genesis 1:26. The sovereignty of he who made resides not in the micro or macro worlds, but in the anthropomorphic divine that fills the universe at all points, with the church being the final manifestation of that matter, and not the so-called unknowable macro nature of God with things like, take for example, his beard being millions of light years in length, or his hand extending into the macro who knows how many miles. These illustrations are useless and revert back to the Gnostic nonsense, when in fact it was the anthro that presented the glorified Christ, where every knee physically bows to the anthropomorphic. Conclusion: Living Temple takes attention away from what is truly defined by the Bible as the Alpha and Omega, which equals everlasting righteousness of an eternal divine, the Logos, whose life was unborrowed, underived. but it should exasperate by now why its counterfeit God Eternal Son doctrine became officially belief in February Fundamental Beliefs 2 and 4. The Alpha heresy of Living Temple, according to E.G. White, is actually the pantheistic principles. But there is much more to spiritualism's attack on the first angel's warning. Many never see the connection to spiritualism, especially when God Eternal Son doctrine relegates Christ to an emanation from a universe that he himself created. Kellogg never totally denied Christ, but fell into the trap of denying that anthropomorphic being is a necessity for humans to grasp, and this pantheism is simple, not so from the perspective of Ezekiel 1's vision, as well as from Jesus Christ's resurrection body. But Elohim are anthropomorphic. How is this to be known? Reason being is that Neoplatonism didn't believe in the anthropomorphic. They believed in the void and energetic principles of creative intelligences. Void universe prior to creation and the emanated eternal Son is the energetic principle or thought projected by the void prior to the ages. The mystical experience of the dark void or timeless experience which takes place in a split second is the key that brings the manifestation of these errors to its fullness at the end of the age. Laodicea has no answers. Yeah, in the book Living Temple, there isn't much about Alpha of Heresies because there isn't much at all. It can be argued spiritualism was not ignored by Sister White, but when one recognizes eternal righteousness by faith, and why Christ identified himself as Alpha and Omega in Revelation 22, it's easy to see Sister White scratch the surface, and the Omega would be startling. She trembled for the people, and they would be in peril. And the extent of this trembling is defined, she said, at the time of the loud cry of the third angel, those who have been in any measure blinded by the enemy, who have not fully recovered themselves from the snare of Satan, will be in peril. The problem of 1888. One of the problems of 88 was what Sister White did not correct. Foremost example is Wagner and Jones, and that equals their born twice or begotten in eternity, which equals one God, Arianism, which is the same as the one God Trinitarian and one God Eternal Son heresy. The reason why Sister White did not rebuke Wagner and Jones was the message of Christ and his righteousness and a growing church, and the National Sunday Law and Papa Pointy Hat was the priority back in the day. Back to case in point, subsequent lesson number 10, June 7th, Spiritualism Exposed. One of the reasons for not solved the Alpha heresy is best realized when Laodicea adopted the triune Godhead and General Conference session. The Omega would follow, and God confirms it is the oppressive law from Isaiah 2. It's easy to see how the dragon ran amok in Laodicea, and the best of the best could not see the spiritualism entering the fundamental beliefs and multiplied by academies, churches, publications. It led to spiritualism's ground zero in 1980 with fundamental beliefs 2 and 4. Does God leave us in darkness? No, but now comes the light on eternal righteousness of he who made. Revelation 13:8, and heaven makes way for the clear understanding of why he who made said, I am Alpha and Omega, the root and the offspring of David. Nevertheless, the elder did lay a very solid foundation with the work on the Godhead. And John 1, which until that awareness had matured, that would then arise the discoveries and detections of doctrinal spiritualism. Revelation 13:8 is a significant marker in the book of Revelation and Alpha and Omega. doctrinal spiritualism, doctrines of devils. The apex of doctrinal spiritualism is the first angel's warning. Why? We are all to be confronted with the Alpha and Omega of deadly heresies. The unity of the one God, unity consciousness, the eighth king of Revelation 17, who is the same in 2 Thessalonians 2, the Antichrist of Revelation 13, the duration of Matthew 24:15. The Godhead and the Alpha and Omega scenarios have been discussed in presentations, and more to be discussed here. The following is a short summary. You will see how the true Alpha and Omega of Revelation 22:16 scenarios, as well as John 1:1, apply, and this is our only safeguard, the Bible, and can only detect the subtle deadliness of spiritualism of that old serpent, the dragon. Example number 1. Here's a link. Please see that. This guy really messed up big time. He assigns Hebrews 1:5 erroneously to a pre-incarnation scenario, disregarding what Isaiah 9:6-7 has to say, as well as Romans 1:3 or John 1:1. Example number 2. Precisely the same problem can be seen in the following first sentence in this link. Revelation 16:5. And I heard the angel of the waters saying, Righteous art thou, who art, and who wast, thou Holy One, because thou didst thus judge. Holy One is one set apart, the Messiah. The Father left all judgment to the Son. Example 3, the link. This false prophet says God is 1 times 1 times 1 equals 1, and that he is still one God. Similar to the Memra, as God replicating himself in the world, in the Word, but still one God, which includes us as well. It's still Neoplatonism, but through this confession still states that we are part of the Godhead, and this is not true on account of no preexistence. This second error would cloud the original duality of two divines of John 1:1 and ascribe Alpha to fallen humans. It is basically the secret doctrine of the occult. It doesn't properly explain what Jesus stated in reference to ye are gods, in terms of the partaking of the divine nature upon acceptance of Jesus in relation to John 17, and echad oneness, whence the Spirit, presence with you, as Christ in you, the hope of glory, Colossians 1:27. The problem with our enemies who wrote this article is that they deny the words of Jesus as quoted above, ye are gods, and sons of the Most High. Supernatural events. The deadly fruitage of ignorance to the concepts of the Alpha and Omega in respect to the true doctrine of God. 2 generations after Sister White passed, an incredible supernatural event happened. The Omega would be accepted. What happened? Mystery Babylon's central doctrine became Laodicean doctrine in 1980. Spiritualism's energy of deception is God the Eternal Son doctrine, and its papal and official doctrine of Laodicea. See the 27 fundamental beliefs, number 4, right there. The Omega is based on a unity of the one true God. That's fundamental beliefs number 2. But at what cost? John 1:1 and John 17:11 and 21-22. Spiritualism's intrusion is both mainstream religious life. Its ultimate goal is worship. It embraced, and no one recognizes it. The first angel's warning in Revelation 14 is God's reminder to not denigrate he who made, but to worship he who made. It should be obvious the first angel's warning is not Sabbath-centric. It is the warning of spiritualism and removal of Christ's eternal identity. The 2 Thessalonians 2 guy of the Third Temple is a Sabbath observer. It's in the 7 Noahide laws. Paul warned about doctrines of devils and knowledge falsely so called, and also made a point about the son of perdition, the 2 Thessalonians 2 guy. See the chart. The parable time clock. The alpha of deadly heresy in the 1st century AD. Following the notes set out additional info on the new Vineyard chart. Paul presents the heresy of the system of emanations and the worship of angelic intermediaries in Colossians 2. He exposes this by declaring that in Jesus Christ there is the fullness of the Godhead bodily. The parable time clock of Jesus in Matthew 20 presents the alpha of deadly heresy in the 1st century, early morning hours of the gospel rite after 6 a.m. right at 9 o'clock with the Gnostics and Docetism. This marked the use of spiritualism against the finished work of Jesus Christ on the cross and a very real material resurrection of the body, of which Jesus stated was not a ghost. Therefore, refuting the claims of the Gnostics. They didn't believe he came in the flesh to forgive and cleanse sin. They believed his flesh was a ghost. There is then the transgression of desolation between the hours of 9 and 12. The 2nd century BC. By way of Philo using Greek philosophy to explain the word equals memra in the Old Testament as being a manifestation of the one God. The denial of the correct interpretation of memra, which was to be done by way of Genesis 1:26, and the anthropomorphic as well as plurality in the creation process, which was not conducted by angels, who were in fact created beings. 3rd century, the Gnostic attack by way of Marcion, who stated that the God of the Old Testament was evil and the God of the New Testament was good. The Catholic Church removed all the Gnostic Gospels and compiled the canon of the New Testament writings, which were known to be authentic, as opposed to all of the Gnostic Gospels that were circulating throughout Europe. Neoplatonism and the Catholic Fathers. The Catholic Fathers formulated the creeds of the Church and formulated the eternal Son doctrine by declaring that Jesus Christ was begotten prior to the ages, not created. This was classic Neoplatonism, which depicted the void universe, which produced an emanation of the Logos, which in turn created the rest of the material world. The Middle Ages. The Church experienced the influx of the heresy of the Alumbrado mystics. Catholic saints such as Teresa de Avila and St. John of the Cross experienced unity consciousness by way of the introverted black void of the unity conscious mysticism. Then there was the intercession of the saints in heaven, and the Bible clearly states in Ecclesiastes 3:19-21. The Eastern Orthodox Church also experienced more direct spiritualism in the form of what is called hesychasm. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, which is unity consciousness, which was at times fought and debated as being good or bad. But by now, 2024, and way back before, that has become a main staple of the doctrinal teachings of the Orthodox branch of what is deemed to be the universal church in the East, which broke with the Catholic Church in the Great Schism of the year 1000 AD. The monks on Mount Athos practice this so-called unity with God, which is non-biblical, since the Bible states that God dwells in unapproachable light where man cannot go. The dead are asleep, Ecclesiastes 3:19 and 9:5-10. During the parable clock hours of 12 and 3, the devil brought in the Fox sisters, mesmerism. The Holy Flesh teachings of 1899 to 1901 were an early form of unity consciousness. Madame Blavatsky, the Theosophist, arrives in the United States and promoted the demonic entities known as the Ascended Masters. Jones and Wagner innocently believed the errors of Neoplatonism by advocating that Christ was begotten at some point far back in time. The result would be the failure of the 1888 message, since spiritualism was not detected. Later, Sister White brought up the errors of Harvey Kellogg, who claimed that God was present in all living things by way of a creative intelligence, which was his spirit, and that there are laws which reveal this God in all things. Premise 1 Timothy 4:1. The omega of deadly heresies at the end of the age. The Beatles arrived on the scene with a clean-cut image, with suits and ties, along with the long hair. In 1967, things changed and took on an occult term for the worse. Their album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, brought in rumors of Paul's death in songs like I Am the Walrus, along with a picture on the album cover that included the renowned occultist Aleister Crowley. The year 1967 was marked by the commencement period of the Akri Hu, that brief period of time of Luke 21:24, and it is stated that when the Beatles got involved with Eastern mysticism and Indian music through George Harrison, some sources point to a belief that Indian gurus started receiving orders from their supposed spiritual masters that it was time to come to America to evangelize the West. But the Spirit saith expressly that in latter times some shall depart away from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils, through the hypocrisy of men that speak lies branded in their own conscience, as with a hot iron, forbidding to marry and commanding to abstain from meats which God created, to be received with thanksgiving by them that believe and know the truth. For every creature of God is good, and nothing is to be rejected, if it be received with thanksgiving, for it is sanctified through the word of God and prayer. Comment. Forbidden to marry and to abstain is a mark of identification when trying to achieve unity consciousness, or unity with the universe. Conclusion. One of the signs of UC will be the attempts to experience unity with the universe, along with the feeling of ecstasy and flights to mystical realms by way of astral projection, etc., as well as the introvertive mystical experience in which the person perceives themselves to be united to physical objects such as birds, rocks, and trees, and the universe in general. Spiritualism's conclusion. The full force of spiritualism with supernatural events commences at the 5 p.m. call of the parable of the workers in the field or vineyard of the Lord, and the chart that is presented shows what was and will be encountered. Here is an example of spiritualism, the one God we are waiting for. And here is the Godhead spiritualism chart. This is the chart that you need to be referring to as you go through this thought paper, cross-referencing back and forth. Very, very important. Okay? Exposing spiritualism thought questions. What's spiritualism? Was Eve exposed to spiritualism? How does doctrines of devils influence spiritualism? Paul's testimony. And you know what? Before we get into the second part, for time for the video, we will need to take a break. And so please see part 2 coming up next.